I was seated at the second table from the stage, my back straight against the chair, my hands resting loosely around the stem of a water glass. The ballroom lights were dimmed to a soft amber, the kind used to suggest generosity and seriousness at the same time. Linen-draped tables filled the room. 500 people, give or take, board members, donors, civic leaders, everyone dressed for photographs. The auctioneer had just stepped aside when Marcus Hale leaned into the microphone. He didn't ask for it, he never did. He took it as if it had been waiting for him. "Before we continue," he said, smiling broadly, "there's a small administrative matter we should clear up." A few people laughed. They thought it was a joke. I took a slow breath through my nose and stayed still. Marcus turned slightly, scanning the tables until his eyes landed where he knew I was sitting. He pointed, casually, like someone flagging a waiter. "There she is," he said. "Elena. Why don't you stand up?" I didn't. The smile tightened just a fraction. He tried again. "Elena Moore, our operations coordinator." The word coordinator hung there, deliberately small. A ripple moved through the room as heads turned. I felt the attention settle without heat. I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, and remained seated. Marcus chuckled into the microphone. "Right," still modest. "That's fine." He tapped the podium once with his knuckle. The sound carried. "For transparency's sake," he continued, "I think it's important everyone understands that Miss Moore's role with the foundation ends tonight." The room went quiet. Not shocked quiet, attentive quiet. Marcus went on, warming to it. "This is a donor-funded organization, which means leadership reflects contribution. And frankly," he shrugged, "Elena was never meant to be permanent." A few uneasy laughs surfaced and died quickly. "She did good clerical work," he said. "Scheduling, emails, logistics, but we're moving in a more elevated direction." He smiled again, wider this time, "and it wouldn't be fair to pretend otherwise." I noticed the way his hand rested flat on the podium, fingers spread. Ownership posture. I also noticed the attorney seated 2 rows ahead of me stiffen, then go very still. Marcus leaned closer to the microphone. "So effective immediately, her access to foundation resources has been revoked. Badge, email, accounts. We'll have security collect her materials at the end of the evening." Someone inhaled sharply near the back of the room. Marcus lifted one palm. "No hard feelings. We all know how these things go. Sometimes people mistake proximity for authority." He let that sit. For a moment, I considered the clock mounted discreetly above the exit doors. 8:47. Right on schedule. I didn't look at him. I didn't look around. I focused on the faint crease in the tablecloth where someone had folded it incorrectly, the way the fabric refused to lie flat. Small imperfections always reveal more than people intend. Marcus cleared his throat. "Of course," he added lightly, "we wish her well. There are plenty of administrative roles out there." That did it. A few people shifted. Chairs whispered against the floor. Someone near the stage murmured my name and then stopped. The silence stretched. Marcus waited for a reaction. He was good at that. He knew how long to pause to make the absence of response feel like defeat. I gave him nothing. I sat there, composed, my shoulders relaxed, my gaze level, as if this were simply another procedural announcement that didn't require my participation. After a few seconds, the silence began to work against him. It always does. Marcus smiled again, sharper now. "All right then, let's continue." He handed the microphone back as if nothing of consequence had occurred. The auctioneer returned, visibly flustered, and began speaking too quickly about donated experiences and matching gifts. The room didn't quite recover its rhythm. Conversations stayed muted. Eyes flicked in my direction and then away. I picked up my napkin and folded it once, then again, aligning the corners with care. My pulse was steady, my breathing even. What Marcus had done wasn't personal. That distinction mattered. He had violated a standard, not a feeling. He had confused visibility with control, volume with authority. People like that always do. I remained seated through the next item, and the one after that. When the applause rose again, it sounded thinner, less confident. No one asked me to leave. Security didn't approach. Marcus didn't look at me again. The room had absorbed the moment, and now it didn't know what to do with it. That was fine. I waited calmly as the silence settled into something heavier than he'd intended. My name is Alina Moore. I was 38 years old at the time, living in Boston, and I had built a stable, unremarkable life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I worked in nonprofit operations and compliance, the kind of work that never makes a stage, but keeps institutions from collapsing under their own weight. I had been with the Hale Foundation for 7 years, not as a volunteer, not as a favor. I was hired to professionalize a donor-driven organization that had grown too quickly and too loosely. My role sat at the intersection of finance, governance, and regulatory compliance. Contracts passed across my desk. Access permissions did too. So did the less visible work, making sure the foundation stayed within the boundaries that kept it credible. Marcus Hale liked to introduce me as support. It made him comfortable. It also allowed him to forget how much of the structure ran through my hands. Our relationship was never personal. That mattered. I wasn't a protege. I wasn't family. I was a stabilizing function. When he traveled, I signed. When donors asked questions, I answered them. When auditors called, they were rooted to me without discussion. There were sacrifices involved. I postponed a promotion opportunity at a larger institution because the foundation needed continuity during a transition year. I absorbed responsibilities that technically belonged to board committees because delays would have raised flags. I did this quietly because that is how systems stay intact. What happened on that stage wasn't a surprise. It was consistent. Marcus had always believed proximity to money translated into ownership of everything around it. The foundation had tolerated that belief because it hadn't yet been tested publicly. That night, it was. There's a difference between embarrassment and injustice. Embarrassment passes. Injustice leaves a record. I didn't respond because there was nothing to clarify. The facts already existed, documented, time-stamped, and validated. My role had never depended on his acknowledgement, and it certainly didn't end because he announced otherwise. Fairness isn't emotional. It's procedural. And procedures don't change just because someone speaks into a microphone. The Hale Foundation didn't become unstable overnight. It drifted there slowly, in small allowances that accumulated because no one wanted to interrupt momentum. Marcus had money, visibility, and confidence. For a long time, that was enough to mask the absence of discipline. In meetings, he spoke first and longest. He dismissed questions with humor. He treated governance as a formality rather than a boundary. None of that was hidden. It was simply tolerated because the checks cleared and the gala photos looked good. Behind the scenes, the work told a different story. Vendor contracts were signed without review and then quietly rerouted to me when terms conflicted with state requirements. Donor restrictions were verbally promised and then retrofitted on paper after the fact. Board votes were recorded retroactively because someone had forgotten to schedule the call. Each time, I corrected the issue without commentary. I logged the changes. I kept the correspondence. I made sure the foundation passed its reviews. Marcus noticed this in the abstract. He never connected it to authority. To him, competence was a utility, not a position. Publicly, he minimized my role. Privately, he deferred to it. There was a pattern to that, too. When donors asked how funds were allocated, he gestured toward me and said, "Alina handles the details." When an auditor requested clarification, he forwarded the email without opening it. When a board member raised concerns about risk exposure, he said, "Alina's already on it." I was always on it. That was the expectation. What he never did was formalize the power that came with those responsibilities. He preferred ambiguity. It allowed him to claim control while avoiding accountability. I didn't push back, not because I lacked leverage, but because timing matters. Institutions don't reward disruption unless the disruption solves a larger problem. So I documented. I standardized processes. I centralized access. I ensured continuity plans existed even when leadership was performative. When Marcus bypassed policy, I corrected downstream effects rather than confronting him upstream. When he made unilateral promises, I made sure the language included contingencies. When he blurred lines, I redrew them quietly and filed the updates. That restraint wasn't passive. It was deliberate. The foundation's growth depended on appearing seamless. Any visible internal conflict would have unsettled donors and invited scrutiny before the structure was ready to withstand it. Over time, my role expanded in practice, if not in title. I became the fixed point. Staff rotated. Board members changed. Donors came and went. The system remained consistent because someone had to be accountable for it. Marcus mistook that consistency for background noise. There were warnings. A regional compliance review flagged governance gaps and recommended clearer separation between donor influence and operational authority. A legal consultant suggested formalizing oversight roles to reduce liability exposure. Marcus acknowledged the memos and moved on. I didn't. I implemented the recommendations where I could, within my remit. Where I couldn't, I prepared the foundation for the day those distinctions would be enforced externally. That day didn't arrive because of a scandal. It arrived because Marcus chose spectacle over structure. When he spoke into that microphone, he assumed hierarchy flowed in one direction, from him outward. He assumed years of quiet correction meant submission. He assumed the room would follow his lead because it always had. Assumptions like that only hold until documentation is read aloud. Patterns don't need commentary. They reveal themselves when pressure is applied. And by the time Marcus decided to make an example of me, the pattern had already written its own conclusion. After the foundation's third year of accelerated growth, the board approved what they called a temporary stabilization phase. That was the language used when donors wanted momentum, but regulators wanted structure. It translated into one directive: reduce risk exposure without slowing public-facing activity. That responsibility landed with me. I wasn't promoted. Titles attract attention, and attention invites interference. Instead, my authority was expanded laterally. I was granted oversight access across departments so I could coordinate compliance. That phrase appeared in the board minutes, approved unanimously, and largely ignored afterward. It mattered more than anyone realized. I was given administrative credentials that allowed me to view financial flows in real time. I didn't control the money, but I could see how it moved. I could verify whether restrictions were honored. I could flag discrepancies before they triggered audits. The board considered this a safeguard. Marcus considered it clerical. At the same time, donor agreements began routing through a centralized repository. Previously, they'd been scattered across inboxes and personal drives. I standardized them, indexed them, linked each to governance requirements and fallback clauses. No one objected. Organization feels harmless when it doesn't challenge ego. Quarterly reviews followed. External consultants were brought in to pressure test governance. They asked careful questions. They recommended redundancies. They suggested clear lines of authority for fiduciary decisions. Marcus attended the first meeting. He skipped the rest. I stayed for all of them. The consultants didn't report to me, but they copied me. They sent drafts. They asked for confirmation. Over time, their recommendations were folded into operating procedures, approved by committees that trusted my summaries. None of this was dramatic. It was procedural, slow, boring even. That's how durable systems are built. There were delays, always delays. Board members traveling, donors needing reassurance. Legal counsel revising language to avoid alarming anyone. Each pause required follow-up. Each follow-up required documentation. I handled it methodically. When new staff were hired, I trained them on access boundaries. Who could authorize what? Where escalation stopped? What required dual acknowledgement? These controls weren't framed as limitations. They were framed as protections. Marcus liked protections as long as they protected him. By the end of the 6th year, the foundation functioned on a clear internal hierarchy, whether it admitted that publicly or not. Operational authority rested with defined roles. Donor influence was advisory, not executive. Financial oversight required multiple confirmations. These structures existed on paper and in practice. They were reviewed annually. They were signed off by professionals whose reputations depended on accuracy. Marcus never read those sections. He trusted the outcome without engaging the mechanism. That trust was unearned, but it was convenient. I didn't correct his misunderstanding. Clarifying it would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have introduced instability before the system was fully insulated. Instead, I made sure continuity plans named roles, not personalities. I ensured access credentials were role-based, not donor-based. I confirmed that emergency governance clauses could be activated without public explanation if thresholds were crossed. All of this was done openly, approved, logged. No one considered it preparation for conflict. It was preparation for responsibility. By the time the foundation entered its 7th year, external risk assessments rated it as low volatility, high resilience. That rating mattered to insurers. It mattered to partner institutions. It mattered to regulators. It did not matter to Marcus. He believed the foundation reflected his will because his name was on the letterhead. He believed authority could be announced and revoked verbally, in rooms where people were watching. He was wrong. By the night of the gala, the foundation no longer depended on his interpretation of power. It depended on systems that had already been tested, reviewed, and approved. I hadn't built those systems for revenge. I had built them because that was my job. When people confuse preparation with loyalty, they leave themselves exposed to the very structures they ignore. The mechanism that mattered most wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secret either. It existed in plain language, buried where few people bothered to look once the headlines were written and the checks were pledged. It took the form of a conditional governance clause tied to donor concentration risk. The consultants had recommended it years earlier, after noting that a small number of individuals accounted for a disproportionate percentage of annual funding. Their concern wasn't moral, it was structural. When too much influence rests with too few contributors, oversight weakens and liability increases. The board agreed, unanimously. The clause was introduced as a safeguard. If a donor or donor representative exercised operational control in a way that exposed the foundation to regulatory or reputational harm, authority would automatically shift to a neutral administrative trustee until compliance was reestablished. No vote required. No debate, just activation. The board saw it as insurance. Marcus barely registered it at all. The trustee role already existed. It had been created to handle transitions, emergencies, and leadership gaps. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with public visibility. It came with responsibility and legal accountability. I had been named as one of 3 eligible trustees during a routine governance update in the foundation's 5th year. Not because of loyalty. Because I met the criteria: tenure, certification, independence from donor funding, and demonstrated operational oversight. The appointment wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. It was documented, notarized, and filed with the foundation's legal counsel. Once activated, the clause did one simple thing. It froze discretionary authority associated with donor status and redirected decision-making to the trustee role until a formal review concluded. There was no punishment embedded in it, no moral judgment, just containment. Marcus had signed off on the governance update that included the clause. His signature appeared on the final page, beneath a paragraph he never read. I knew about the clause because I had helped implement the surrounding procedures. I ensured activation thresholds were clear. I confirmed that notifications were automatic. I verified that the process could not be interrupted by public statements or internal pressure. What I didn't do was trigger it. I couldn't, and I didn't need to. Activation required a documented instance of a donor exercising unilateral operational authority in a public setting, resulting in reputational exposure. The language was precise. The bar was intentionally high. That night at the gala, Marcus cleared it effortlessly. By announcing my termination, revoking access, and directing security action without board consultation or trustee involvement, he had asserted operational control he did not formally possess. The system logged it. Audio recordings existed. Witnesses existed. The announcement had been made from a foundation-branded stage during an official event with donor media present. I didn't submit a complaint. I didn't file a report. I didn't alert anyone. The protocol didn't require my participation. Within 48 hours, legal counsel was obligated to review the incident. Within 72, the trustee framework would be provisionally activated pending findings. During that period, donor-linked authority would be suspended by default. No appeal process existed at that stage. Only review. This wasn't a trap. It wasn't clever. It was boring in the way only well-designed systems are boring. Marcus believed power was performative. The clause assumed the opposite, that power required restraint. I had known about it for years. I had never needed it before. By the time Marcus finished his champagne and accepted congratulations for a successful evening, the lever was already moving, quietly, exactly as designed. Order doesn't announce itself. It just proceeds. And once it does, it doesn't ask permission to continue. The notice went out the following Monday morning, not publicly, internally. A special session of the board and senior advisors convened to review a governance continuity matter. That was the phrase legal counsel chose. Neutral, contained, impossible to argue with. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the smaller conference room on the 18th floor. Glass walls, long table, city in the background, muted by height and distance. The kind of room designed to discourage raised voices. I arrived early and took a seat near the end of the table. Not at the head, not opposite anyone. I placed my phone face down beside a legal pad and aligned my pen parallel to its edge. Then I waited. One by one, the others filtered in. Board members first. 2 attorneys. An external compliance officer I recognized from prior reviews. Quiet greetings, low voices, no speculation. Marcus arrived last. He entered with confidence, jacket over one shoulder, already speaking as if the meeting had begun before he crossed the threshold. "I've got 20 minutes, he said, smiling. "Let's be efficient." No one responded immediately. The chair cleared her throat and nodded toward legal counsel. "Let's proceed." The attorney opened a folder and slid a document across the table. Not to Marcus. To the center. He didn't pick it up. "We're here to review an incident that occurred during the Foundation's annual gala," the attorney said evenly. "Specifically, a public assertion of operational authority made without board authorization." Marcus waved a hand. "This again. I handled a staffing issue, perfectly within reason." There was a pause, a deliberate one. The compliance officer spoke next. "For the record, this session is being documented." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Fine. Document away." The attorney nodded and continued. "An audio recording of the announcement was reviewed. Witness statements were collected. Media presence was confirmed." Marcus's smile faltered, just slightly. "You're overcomplicating this." No one answered him. The attorney turned a page. Per Section 4.7 of the Governance Continuity Framework, a donor or donor representative may not unilaterally revoke operational access or terminate staff in a public forum without trustee concurrence. Marcus frowned. "That clause is about reputational crises." "Yes," the attorney said, "this qualifies." Silence settled over the table. It wasn't heavy yet, just attentive. The chair folded her hands. As a result, the trustee framework was provisionally activated pending review. Marcus sat forward. "Activated by whom?" "Automatically," the compliance officer said. "Per protocol." Marcus's gaze flicked around the room, landing briefly on me for the first time. "This is absurd," he said. "Elena doesn't even work here anymore." I didn't respond. The attorney spoke instead. "That determination is not within donor discretion. Employment status remains unchanged until trustee review concludes." Marcus's voice rose. "You're telling me I can't remove someone from my own foundation?" The chair met his eyes. "You're being told that authority is currently suspended." The word hung there. Marcus laughed, sharp and short. "Suspended? This is a misunderstanding." No one moved to reassure him. The compliance officer slid another document forward. "As of Friday, discretionary approvals associated with donor status have been temporarily frozen. Financial sign-offs, access directives, public representation." Marcus stared at the paper. "This has to be a mistake." "It isn't," the attorney said. The room went quiet again. This time the silence pressed in. Marcus looked at me. "You knew about this?" I waited a beat before answering. Not because I needed time, but because the pause mattered. It's in the governance materials, I said. My voice was level. Approved years ago. That's not an answer, he snapped. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The chair turned to Marcus. This review will take up to 30 days. During that time, operational authority rests with the trustee, Marcus scoffed. And who exactly is that? The attorney glanced at the compliance officer, then at the chair. The chair looked down at her notes. Elena Moore, she said. The shift was immediate. Marcus pushed his chair back slightly. No, absolutely not. The attorney slid the appointment document forward. Her name appears here as one of 3 eligible trustees, the others recused due to donor affiliations. Marcus stood halfway, hands braced on the table. This is a setup. No one reacted. The compliance officer spoke calmly. The clause is clear. The activation criteria were met. The assignment is valid. Marcus's voice cracked. You can't be serious. The chair held his gaze. Sit down, Marcus. He didn't. His breathing quickened. This is my reputation. My money, you can't just... The attorney interrupted. This is not punitive, it's procedural. Marcus turned to me again. Say something. I met his eyes briefly, then looked back at the table. The process will run, I said. That's all. For a moment, it looked like he might argue further. Threats formed and dissolved in his expression. He searched the room for leverage and found none. The silence stretched until it became undeniable. Finally, he sat. The attorney closed the folder. We'll reconvene once the review concludes. Chairs scraped softly as people stood. Papers were gathered. The meeting ended without ceremony. Marcus remained seated as the room emptied, staring at the document in front of him as if it had appeared from nowhere. I didn't look back when I left. By the time the door closed behind me, the outcome was no longer subject to discussion. The system had spoken, and it wasn't finished yet. The review didn't make headlines. That was intentional. Governance corrections rarely do. They unfold quietly through notices, confirmations, and expired permissions that don't renew. 2 weeks later, legal counsel issued a preliminary finding. The activation had been valid. The public announcement at the gala met the threshold for reputational exposure. The trustee framework would remain in place until final resolution. Marcus's attorneys contested it immediately. Motions were filed. Letters sent. None of it changed the timeline. The clause didn't allow for acceleration or delay based on volume. By the end of the first month, discretionary authority tied to donor status was formally separated from operations. Access badges were reissued. Email permissions adjusted. Signature authority reallocated according to the continuity plan. Marcus's name remained on the letterhead. It no longer opened doors. A second challenge followed. This one questioned the legitimacy of the trustee appointment. The response was brief. The appointment had been approved years earlier, documented, and reaffirmed during annual reviews. The window for objection had closed long before the gala. That challenge failed as well. By the end of the quarter, partner institutions updated their contact protocols. Invitations were rerouted. Requests for representation were declined, pending governance review. The phrasing was consistent across communications, as if copied from the same template. Donors noticed. Some asked questions. Others adjusted their involvement quietly. Funding stabilized, then diversified, reducing reliance on any single contributor. The foundation's risk profile improved. Insurers took note. Marcus wasn't present for any of it. He stopped appearing at events first. Then his name disappeared from program agendas. A planned keynote appearance was canceled due to scheduling conflicts. A panel invitation went unanswered and quietly expired. By the end of the year, the review concluded. The findings were final. Operational authority remained independent. The trustee framework was folded into permanent governance, no longer provisional. There was no announcement, just an update to internal documentation and a brief notice to regulators confirming compliance. Marcus's legal challenges ended soon after, not with a settlement but with silence. Appeals require energy. So does relevance. I learned about the last filing indirectly, through a routine update forwarded by counsel. I read it once, noted the outcome, and archived it. Consequences don't need witnesses, they just need time. Institutions remember structure long after personalities fade. And once access is gone, it rarely returns in the same form. When the matter was finished, it didn't feel finished in any dramatic sense. There was no release, no moment that invited reflection beyond what was necessary. Systems rarely announce closure. They simply stop requiring attention. I returned to my work, not at the foundation exclusively, but within the same professional lane. Oversight, compliance, transitional governance. The kind of roles that exist to keep institutions aligned with their stated values, even when those values become inconvenient. The Hale Foundation stabilized, its reporting improved, its governance tightened. That wasn't credited to anyone publicly, and that was appropriate. Structures don't need recognition. They need maintenance. Marcus never reached out. I didn't expect him to. Once authority is clarified formally, personal appeals lose their function. There's nothing left to negotiate. Justice, when it's done properly, doesn't humiliate. It restores order. I didn't take satisfaction in his absence. I took confidence in the fact that the boundary held. That when someone attempted to convert visibility into control, the system corrected itself without spectacle. There was one small decision I made at the end of that year. I declined an invitation to rejoin the foundation in a visible leadership role. Instead, I recommended a candidate with less history and more neutrality. Continuity matters more than credit. Distance can be a form of stewardship. The gala where Marcus spoke so freely became just another entry in an archive. A date, a transcript, a reference point in a compliance memo that no one reads twice. That was enough. The work continued elsewhere. Quietly, correctly, and the matter remained settled, exactly where it belonged.